Michael Van Runkle here for HotCars.com. I'm up in the Hollywood Hills. This is the land of German cars, supercars, G-Wagons, but there's not many like this, a Mercedes-Benz SLR McLaren. You gotta understand, this thing came straight out of left field. But the real question is, how does a German, British, supercharged V8 powered supercar, muscle car thing drive? Let's hop behind the wheel and go for a spin, but first please like this video and subscribe to our channel. It really helps us out. Thanks.
That man is mustachioed, and he bears a heavy load. He goes where he wants to go. That man is mustachioed. Look at that stash.
Wow.
Now I did drive this car up here, so I can tell you right off the bat, it's pretty gnarly. But the first thing you have to learn when you get into a car like this is how to turn it on. And it took me like a good 10 minutes to figure that out. Because I'm so used to push button starts and remote keys, this has a key that you do have to turn. You can hear the fuel pump starting up. And then it's like, all right, well that didn't fire it up. Is my foot not on the brake? No, my foot's on the brake. And then you have to find the start stop button, which is in almost Lamborghini style, right on the top of the gear shifter. Kind of dig it. So let's go find some open road. Now I'm in this car today thanks to Tactical Fleet, a supercar and luxury car dealer that just opened a showroom here in Beverly Hills this year in March of 2022. And they're trying to get the word out that they've got some of the coolest cars on the planet. They do supercars, mostly new stuff, Lamborghinis, Ferraris, McLarens, Porsches. But when a unicorn like this car comes around, nobody can say no. And there's no doubt this thing is 100% a unicorn. I can count on one hand how many I've seen in person. I think it's 3, including this one. They're really cool. The Mercedes SLR McLaren harkens back to the 300 SL, or more accurately, to the 300 SLR, the silver arrows that just dominated Grand Prix racing in the 1950s. And that F1 ethos is where this all comes from. Here in the United States, buyers are probably thinking, why on earth are McLaren and Mercedes-Benz working together? Is that the McLaren I'm thinking of? Because in those days, McLaren, yeah, they had an F1 team and they had built the F1, but the F1, a road-going car, had a BMW engine. Now they're working with Mercedes. But at the time, McLaren and Mercedes were working together on their current F1 cars. So, to Europeans, and really the rest of the world that actually watches Formula One, the partnership makes a lot more sense. It's historically significant also because this sort of marked the beginning of Mercedes really going towards a sportier market. Yeah, they had like the ML class SUV in the same era. You gotta remember this thing came out in the early 2000s. The first model year was 2003, so call it a 2002 debut. That was only, 6 or 7 years after the end of the McLaren F1, and it would be another decade before the MP412C, which established or re-established McLaren as a supercar manufacturer today. I'm stuck here on Mulholland, driving in the curves and traffic a little bit, but you can feel that heritage coming through, even if it's not really a mid-engine car like I would think of a modern McLaren. It's definitely got some Mercedes roots. I grew up driving a 2001 CLK 320 that my stepdad owned, and there are some similarities, but this is just on a whole different level. We've got a supercharged V8 doing 617 horsepower and 575 pound-feet of torque. There's a lot of carbon fiber everywhere, but the car still weighs 3,750 pounds, which is not insignificant. But the driving dynamics are totally unlike the comparables I would think of in my head, which are really modern Hellcat Dodges. It's got the long hood, it's got the big V8, it's got some rumble, it's got a good amount of supercharger whine, but instead of that sort of boat-like Dodge driving experience, This thing is low and taut and bumpy. The steering is super heavy and precise. It's just unlike really anything else I've ever driven, I think. This specific car is a 2006 model year, which I believe was the final model year, though there may have been some 2007s. It's got 3,447 miles on the clock right now. We'll have a few more once I'm done shooting this video. And Technical Fleet is asking for $500,000 for this baby. And I can totally understand. I'm driving around in Hollywood and people are staring. It's ridiculous. And it's understandable. It almost looks photoshopped in pictures. And in real life, if you've never been up close and personal with one, it's longer and lower and flatter. Those vents are a lot meaner than they look in images. It's a completely different experience in real life. Driving it, you know, that long, low profile means the rear visibility is not too great. The mirrors are tiny and sort of insectoid, almost like early versions of what Pagani is doing now. The cool part is it's almost got Gullwing doors, but really they open sort of 45-degree angle. They don't go straight up, and they're not exactly the Gullwings that would then come out on the SLS, and then the SLS would completely drop those for the GT Coupe in the modern years of Mercedes. This is not an AMG car. That's an important distinction. Now, because this was the early to mid 2000s, it does have a 5-speed automatic only. It's got manual shifting modes, which are funny because they're side to side, which I've also never seen on any car ever. It's usually front and back, though those sometimes switch for which is shifting up and which is shifting down. It's also got buttons on the steering wheel for shifting. I wouldn't call them paddles. They're more like little buttons, but they do the job. It shifts all right. It's pretty smooth in town because it's got so much low-end torque. And then once you start getting up into the higher RPMs, oh, it just sounds so good. Now, I wish I had a little bit more time with this thing because I would love to take it onto a track. But it's also got the experience of being a supercar that you really don't have to worry about too much. It's not super low like a modern McLaren, and it's not exactly as finicky because you're not sort of pranging around and bumping. It's sort of a happy middle zone of being a nice grand tourer and being able to push it a little bit hard. Like if I get onto a little straightaway here, it gets real squirrely real fast. No problem, because it's got so much torque. And that's the glory of supercharged engines. I love superchargers. I think the first supercharged car I ever drove was a Lotus Evora, and then I drove a bunch of Chargers and Challenger Hellcats at Radford Racing School. You can check out our videos on those if you want, and they're a ton of fun, but they taught me how to be ready for when the rear end breaks loose, which this thing can do with ease, despite weighing that 3,750 pounds. It's pretty cool, and then when you start sort of pushing it a little harder, you don't get a ton of body roll. It's an awesome combination of Mercedes, which was building big dentist cars or whatever, and hadn't really gotten into the sports car side of things. On the other hand, you've got the McLaren side giving you some of that sportier element. There is some funny little things, like this whole metal dash is very early 2000s. We've got a radio hidden beneath this little door. There's a fun little detail. You can raise the rear wing by pushing this little thing that's like a wing that goes up and down. The shifter is great. The mirror controls are right here. The door handle is by your left thigh, and the e-brake is on this side. They're funny little details that are like, yeah, this is not a normal Mercedes from the era. It took me, again, like probably 20 minutes to figure out how to open the hood, because it's a clamshell hood to go along with the semi-butterfly doors. So you gotta pop it up and then forward and then forward. It's really cool. And then you get to see that big V8. It's mounted really far back in the engine bay, which is why probably this thing has such good balance. It's like a mid-engine car, it's just a front mid-engine car. Sort of along the lines of why BMWs are so great and have such excellent handling for front-engine cars that are rear-wheel drive. And even though it's got some of that Mercedes element, remember, once again, back in the early 2000s, this was a pretty radical design. And the design has withstood the test of time, which is part of why this is now a $500,000 car. They also had the chop top sterling moss editions. I think Kanye bought one of those recently. Those are well over $1 million bucks. But I'm a coupe guy, and I just love the design of this car, especially the front end. The rear maybe could have used a little bit more work, in my humble opinion. But I mean, you see one of these coming down the road and there's just absolutely nothing like it. And I'm just glad I got to experience driving it. We're only on 19-inch wheels, but they look so cool because they're the turbine wheels, which refer to sort of the jet age of the original SLRs, but also the fact that there's a supercharger under the hood. They're 19-inch wheels. They're wearing 225mm tires up front, 295 at the rear. These are Michelin Pilot Sports. But as I showed you, this thing can break those loose, no problem. Some other cool details are the floor hinging accelerator pedal is matched by a floor hinging brake pedal. And this thing's actually got pretty good brakes, but it does take a little bit of getting used to. You come into a corner and you touch the brakes and you can feel them start, and then they get nice and firm. And I think that's partly because it does weigh 3,700 pounds. But then if you give it a little gas, like I said, whoa, it gets squirrely really fast. We were up to about 5,000 RPM there, and it's still struggling to put power down. You know, in the early 2000s, you had sort of primitive traction control systems, but it almost makes things more fun. Modern McLarens have such incredible traction control that you feel like you're just the best driver in the world. When in reality, if you turned that off, you'd be slipping and sliding all over the place. It's all just a total throwback from a different era, and I'm really enjoying it. This has always been sort of a halo car for me. Not that I would ever buy one, but because it's just something so different than anything else. Once you start pushing it hard, it just sounds so good. It's surprisingly composed and nimble. It's flat and taut, but not uncomfortable. It's just a really fun car to drive. The steering is really tight and stiff. It's not like supercar level or Lotus level, but it just takes a little bit of muscle, which I appreciate. And then you give it the beans and you get going pretty good and fast. And you hear that supercharger whine. The exhaust just feels good. It really is a muscle car combined with a German Grand Tourer combined with a McLaren in all the best ways possible. You've got all the power you could ever need, just torque for years. And then you've got the style to match. It's timeless. The fact that people are willing to pay 500 grand for these today shows how well they absolutely nailed the design of the SLR McLaren approximately 20 years ago now. Of course, this car being in 2006, more like 15 years ago, but it's still so of its own era and then also so timeless. If you get a chance to drive one, I'd highly recommend it. If you've got 500 grand burning a hole in your pocket, call up Tactical Fleet. They're being really low key about this. Their whole thing is no pitches, no high pressure. They just let the cars sell themselves. And if I had to guess, this thing's gonna sell itself real quick. I hope you learned something about the Mercedes-Benz SLR McLaren. It's an awesome car from a different era that really doesn't exist anymore. Big thanks to Tactical Fleet for loaning me this car for the afternoon. And before you sign off, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. It really helps us out. Thanks.